Come on, you can give Abba better praise than that. Hallelujah. You can be seated if you're able. Today's a great day. How many of you know that the Shabbat is a set aside, a holy convocation? And it's not an accident that you were chosen to celebrate this holy convocation with the creator of the universe. I don't take that for granted, and prayerfully you don't either. Before we get started, I want to apologize. I've been having some issues with my voice, and so you may have a little bit more of a Barry White today than you would my traditional voice, but prayerfully the message will come through. Today's also a very interesting season for many of you, because you know that there are things that's happening all around us, and it's being manifest as we speak. Abba's revealing himself, but oh my goodness, the things that he's allowing us to walk through in preparation for the glory that's about to be poured out on us. I don't know if you can sense that, but it seems to me as if the atmosphere in the spirit realm has increased at a feverish pitch. And every week, Father has just gifted us with the ability to be able to receive a powerful word. And this word that we're going to look at this afternoon, Acharei mode, if you're familiar with this particular Torah portion, it's very powerful. And it sets in motion some things in the scripture that very few of us probably have ever seen before. We're going to look at it from a little slightly different perspective than we have in the past. If you'll indulge me, I promise you that you will hear some things that you have never heard before. Turn to your neighbor and tell them, I can't believe that. Well, just hang on and you'll find out. But if you hear something you've never heard before, I want to remind you of 2 Timothy 2:15. What does it say? Study to show for yourself. That means if you're going to be run up in a wreck, you need to be the one driving. Are you listening to me? Study to show yourselves approved unto Yahweh, workmen that need not to be ashamed. How can I keep from being ashamed? Only by rightly dividing the word of truth. This Torah portion begins in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 1 through 18, chapter 18, verse 30. And it's really unique because it starts off giving us some ritual purity instructions that all of Israel is supposed to abide by. And I know that this is something, if you look at it, it seems almost antiquated, but if we've studied these Torah portions over the years, and we've found that they are living blueprints for the season that we're now in. And so if these rehearsals were there to teach Israel about ritual purity, and I believe that we are the body of Messiah. I believe we're the house of Israel. I also am firmly convinced that he's teaching us about ritual purity as well, how to properly approach him, the protocol that's necessary to entertain the presence of the Most High. I'm convinced that that's something that has been lost, in particular here in the Western nations. We don't really understand the protocol when a dignitary arrives on the scene. Even in courtrooms, there's proper protocol. And the powers that be understand that, and they abide by that. But by and large, most of us, in particular in the community that calls ourselves believers, we've lost that understanding of protocol, and therefore we come into the courtroom or the throne room of the king. We don't know how to approach him properly, and so we don't have the proper standing, and therefore we don't have proper jurisdiction. And so we're lucky, if you'll allow that, if we even get our case heard. Say amen. And that's why many of us remain in bondage to this day. It's simply because we don't know the proper protocol in approaching the king and how to apply the word that he's given us in our lives to make sure that we are in fact set free. Turn to your neighbor and tell him, I'm set free. Now, it's interesting because this Torah portion, how many of you are familiar with Nadab and Abihu? The strange fire. They bring strange fire to the tabernacle, and they're both consumed quickly. Well, if you go back and look at what the rabbis have to say about Nadab and Abihu, they actually paint them in a favorable light. They give all kinds of different excuses. Well, they were, their souls were taken out of their body, and they're standing before the Creator. And I would say, in my opinion, Abba knows who he's going to take out. He knows that when an individual is in fact taken out, there's a reason for it. And you can look, if you will, in the Hebrew language, and you can find exactly why Nadab and Abihu were taken out. It was not because of some of the things that you find in the sages' remarks. But anyway, we're going to look at that. In regards to ritual purity, Yahweh stops for a season here in Leviticus chapter 16, and he begins to take Israel and point them backward to this particular calamity that had befallen the sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu. And again, to reiterate, they had approached the holy place, the altar throne of Yahweh, in an untoward manner. Did you hear what I just said? That's protocol. And if we do believe that when we come together in this kind of an assembly that we are actually approaching the throne room, then that means you just can't come into the throne room, into the presence of the king with just anything in here. Does that make sense? If there's something going on in your life that needs to be taken care of, you need to deal with it prior to coming before the presence of the Creator. I submit that if we do that, then we're not going to be one of those individuals that fall into the category of Nadab and Abihu. And so we need to ask ourselves why. You see the Creator giving some explicit instructions to Aaron regarding this protocol, and it's specifically at this season, almost a year later than the original Mount Sinai occurrence, where they go up on Mount Sinai, Moses and the 70 elders. And this is at what we would commonly refer to the Holy Convocation as Yom Kippur. So he's given some explicit instructions to Aaron regarding, again, protocol for accessing the holies of holies. And, it specifies this one time of year during the season known as Yom Kippur. And it's in my opinion that Yom Kippur is actual rehearsal of the final stage of restoration of the altar of Yahweh here on the earth. And I also believe that Yom Kippur was a rehearsal to reintroduce, if you will, as that altar throne is restored, to reintroduce the priesthood, the Melchizedek priesthood. And if you study that, you'll find that the Melchizedek priesthood was interrupted at the time of the fall, and so there had to be a temporary priestly order set in motion until the altar could be completely restored and the king priest appear in the earth. Does that make sense? And so this is a rehearsal. And it's important because if there is a temporary method that is set in place, like we see this ritual of Yom Kippur and Aaron approaching once a year, and he has to be in the right relationship with Yahweh or he falls down dead, I would submit to you that these things have to be followed precisely. Does that make sense to you? And so what I want to do is to take you back and help you hopefully put this in its proper context as we look at the two principal characters, Nadab and Abihu. I apologize. I'm really struggling. Let's look at the word Nadab. In Hebrew, it's Strong's number 5070. The usual translation of the name is generous or liberal, but it actually comes from a root that means to incite or to impel something. He's an instigator. That's what his name actually means. It's my personal opinion that Nadab comes from the same root as the Nun Vav Dalet root, Nud or Nod. Remember, Cain was wandering in the land called Nod? And it's the same root word, if you go back and look at it, with the bait that is actually appended in it, and it's pointing towards the house or the bride. And so the term Nadab could actually be translated as one who causes the bride or the house to wander aimlessly, to mourn. And it's the nature of that name is indicating that he's inciting that. And I have several. And then we have Abihu. Say that with me, Abihu or Abihu. The general sense of this word, as it's normally translated, is he whose father is Yahweh. Well, it's rather ambiguous on the surface, but you have to break it apart. And so there are two words that comprise the phrase Avihu. It's Avi and Chava. And when you rearrange, both of those words give you a definition that means to long for something, to lust for it. And it can indicate to desire or to lust after the commandments of Yahweh, but it also points more specifically to an uncontrolled lustful behavior, which later becomes symbolic of the nation of Israel as a whole. And so once again, there's another layer built upon who these two individuals are, and we're going to look at that. Acharei mot, after the death. Well, most of you are familiar with what transpired to cause the death of Nadab and Abihu, the offering of strange fire. And it's laid out in Leviticus chapter 10, verse 1. And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer, and put fire therein and incense thereon, and offered strange fire before Yahweh, which he commanded them not. Now let me just share this with you. If you don't take the time to dig below the surface, in particular when you're looking at the King James English, you're going to miss what is said. You need to be able to take it back to the Hebrew text. Does that mean you need to be fluent in Hebrew? Absolutely not. It just means that you need to take advantage of the tools that are available for us now, like no other time in creation, and to extricate from the Hebrew language the truth that's embedded. And you need to also look at it in context. The King James gives you very little to feed your spirit man. However, the Hebrew language has embedded into it some things in the text that will just literally blow your mind. For instance, let's look at that term for censer. They took their censer or their fire pot. It comes from the word maktah, and it's simply rendered or translated as a fire pan, but it also has a numeric value associated with it. And whenever you look at the numeric values associated with these words, they reach out like a spider's web, and they'll reach out and they'll connect to whatever was close to it, and give you an indication that whatever it's being connected to is like relatives in a house. They take you back to an original source, an original root, and they become related. Does that make sense? And so if you look at the numeric values, they have some other hidden clues. And if you look at that word maktah, its numeric value is the same, 453, as the Hebrew phrase nefesh chaya. And so something regarding this fire pan or this censer is going to reach back now to the first time we hear nefesh chaya, the breath of life, mentioned and be connected to it. Does that make sense? So there's something regarding this rehearsal that Nadab and Abihu is involved in that is also connected to the first instance that we hear the term nefesh chaya, the breath of life. And you can see that back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. How many of you remember? Yahweh takes the Adam and he forms his body, and what does he do? He breathes into him the breath of life. Now, in order to flesh this out, no pun intended, we need to look at context here. At the particular moment, Genesis 2:7, we're talking about Yahweh forming the man and breathing into him. But just prior to that, in verse 6, it says that there was a mist that went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. And so from this text and the link that we had here in the numeric values, 453, connecting us back to this word censer, I believe you can find some evidence, and I believe it is ample evidence to give you more than just circumstantial proof, but to give you some insight regarding exactly why these two individuals were killed. Listen to me, it was not an accident. Are you hearing me? And so I want to put this in its context, the word mist here. Is this okay? Can y'all understand me? Again, I apologize for my voice. The word for mist here is the word ed, and it's translated as an exhalation, like a vapor. When the breath comes out, it has vapor in it. And it's interesting because it comes from the same Hebrew word, oud, and that word oud means a firebrand or a poker. How many of you have a fireplace here in Oregon? Well, your poker in Hebrew would be called an oud. You go in, you reach among the embers, you bring the embers close together to concentrate your fire. Or you would take a little shovel, an oud, and reach in and you would take some embers out if you wanted to use those embers for something else. And so it's an instrument that's used to turn or to gather embers. And next you see the word watered. And in Hebrew it's the word shakah. And it's translated as to cause to drink, to furnish a potion to something, to bring water in a cup as in a cupbearer would do. But I want you to look at the sheen kuf root. And it's interesting because that sheen kuf root of shakah, which is what translated as watered, it's where you get the English word sack. Sheen kuf, sack. Sack. And it's interesting because there's a lot of English words, if you just take the time, you can see how they were etymologically taken from the Hebrew language. Well, this word sack here, sok, indicates to cover the loins. And in the process of covering the loins, I'm transporting something. As these loins move, and I hope that I'm delicate enough that you'll understand, as the loins of the man move, it's transporting the seed of the man. Does that make sense? And so from the Hebrew language, it seems that this censer connected to the mist and connected to this word water, that it actually was relating to an instrument that was used to gather the embers of fire at creation here into a censer, into a fire pot, a cup of sorts. And these embers would have been poured into a sack. And the sack is the Adamah, the place that the Adam was taken out of. Does that make sense to you? Note in my notes for you, you have the word Adam, man. The word for man is ish. And then you have the Hebrew word for fire, esh. I have them both for you up there in my notes. And so the Adam literally becomes a man of fire or a man on fire. You should literally be a man on fire. And ish. Does that make sense? Well, the Adam was formed, and then as those embers are gathered together, remember, it's a tool that gathers embers together. The embers have no life of their own until there is a breath that fire has to breathe. I spent a number of years working in the fire department, and there were times when we would be in a fully involved fire that the wind would be measured at those house fires over 100 miles an hour. Why? Because the fire is sucking wind, it's sucking breath to it. And so here's the Adam. He's laid out on the Adamah, the altar of Yahweh. He is a smoldering ember. And all of a sudden you have Yahweh himself hovering over the man, and he breathes onto the man the breath, the nefesh kaya. And the man begins to just literally inhale, to breathe the breath of Yahweh, and that's when the man becomes a living, viable entity. That's when creation explodes inside this man. That's powerful. And so what you're seeing here literally is the evidence of the seed of Yahweh. Now, we're talking about these fire pots, these censers, and it's the seed of Yahweh that's being exhaled, that mist, that water vapor that's being exhaled out of Yahweh, the breath of Yahweh. And it's nothing short of the seminal fluid. Again, I'm trying to be as delicate as I can, from the loins, the inward man or inward part of Elohim that is being released into the Adam. And as it's released into the Adam, it not only is creating, but it's also consuming. It doesn't mean that Adam is burned up. It literally means that all of Adam belongs to us. And as Yahweh breathes onto him, I believe that he in turn inhales and exhales, and he's inhaling the Adam and breathing himself into him. And so Adam literally becomes a fire himself, a sacrifice by fire, an offering laid out on the altar of the earth in front of Yahweh. And you have to ask yourself, what was the purpose of him being laid out on the altar? That's powerful. That should be intriguing enough to ask you that. Okay, and we'll answer it. Now, is it possible that the ritual that Aaron was being trained for, including the taking of these censers, or fire pans, which we find Nadab and Abihu intruding over into an area? In fact, I'll show you in a little while that there's no place in Scripture that says Nadab and Abihu were charged with bringing the censers or the fire. No place in Scripture that it says that they had that responsibility. And so is it possible that the ritual that Aaron's being trained for and that Nadab and Abihu usurp, regarding where their fire pans are filled with incense to offer up before Yahweh, is it possible that it could be related to that incident or rehearsal of the initial formation and the first breathing of the breath of life into a living tabernacle man? Remember, Adam was the first man that became the dwelling place of Yahweh. Am I right? And Adam becomes a shadow picture of that is rehearsed in the wilderness tabernacle. The wilderness is laid out, the wilderness tabernacle is laid out in the form of a man. And so throughout the wilderness rituals, the very same thing that occurred in Genesis chapter 2 is being rehearsed on a consistent basis in the wilderness in preparation for the coming of the last Adam, our Messiah, Yeshua, who would be a perfect man. The wilderness tabernacle is a picture of an imperfect man after the fall. And so there's a rehearsal going on of a constant restoration, a reclamation project if you will, to go back and restore that fallen man to what he was originally intended to be, okay? And so, look at the word for incense. These two men bring a fire pot, but they also have incense on it. Now, that word for incense is Acharei, and it is traditionally rendered incense, which is connected with the smoke or the odor of a burning sacrifice. But it actually comes from the root of that word, katar, which means the hip joint or the loins. Listen to me. And something that helps to make the man stable regarding his loins. This area here in my hip is what stabilizes me as a man. Now, we look at it from the natural, and I can understand it, but what about from a spiritual perspective? My loins, whatever seed I released out, and we understand it's talking about from the natural loins, but we also realize that there's a spiritual connotation as well. The seed that releases out of me, out of the inward loins of me as a man, is what stabilizes me and gives me a footing or a foundation in the earth. Are y'all hearing that? And so that root word, katar, also gives you the mindset of something that is twisted, as in a twisted connection, like you take a couple of wires and twist them together to form an electrical connection. And it also indicates a very complicated problem that is being solved as I'm stabilized, as the man's loins are being stabilized, as this connection's being twisted together. A complicated problem, heretofore unsolved, is now being solved. What problem is this alluding to? Well, I believe if you go back and study Genesis chapter 1, you understand that the earth was in a tohu vabohu, waste and desolate condition. And so all of Genesis chapter 1 up into the end of chapter 2 is dealing specifically with a recreation project or reclamation project. And what Yahweh's doing is he's solving the problem of a waste and desolate creation that had been made that way because of rebellion. And he brings the man and he creates the man and puts the man in a place where that man becomes the instrument that's going to be used to reclaim the altar throne that had been broken and breached, and thus resulted in a tohu vabohu condition. Does that make sense? So pay close attention. In Genesis, you see that the condition is because of the rebellion of those that had fallen. You have tohu vabohu, waste and desolate. From that time forward, the tabernacle of Yahweh had also been desecrated, and it had to be cleansed by a sacrifice or an offering of fire. That's why you see throughout the wilderness rehearsals, you always see things cleansed and rehearsed, purged, if you will, by a sacrifice of fire. And so, in response to that, you see in Genesis chapter 2 what happens. The earth has to be reclaimed. The altar throne has to be reclaimed. Yahweh's going all the way through, creating all of creation. He creates the man. He puts the man in the garden. And so you find Adam being laid out on the Adamah, the altar. And Adam is the ish, the word for man, but it's also the esh, same etymological root. He is a man of fire, a man who is going to be set on fire. He literally is a man who would be consumed by fire. Is that making sense to you? The man, the Adam, literally becomes the censer. He becomes that fire pan. The man becomes the one that contains the embers. He has the sparks of DNA in him, and all he's waiting for is the breath of the Ruach, the incense of Yahweh, to breathe upon him, thus igniting him as the offering that is to be laid out on the altar. That's what's taking place in Genesis chapter 2. And from chapter 2 forward, after the fall, you see throughout the wilderness tabernacle, we're constantly having to have a sacrifice of fire in order to purge something. You can't cleanse the altar without fire. You can't cleanse the tabernacle without fire. You can't have a sacrifice without fire. Does this make sense? Hebrews chapter 12, verse 29 says what? Yahweh is a consuming fire. Let me just share this with you. If you come before the Creator, if he is in fact a consuming fire, and there's wood, hay, and stubble in here, that is going to be burned up. Am I right? The flesh is going to be consumed. And so after what is consumable by the fire of Yahweh is removed, then there should be nothing but a refined man. How many of you have been through the fire lately? Come on. And the purpose of that is to remove the dross, to remove the wood, hay, and the stubble so that gold, silver, and precious stones can be left. Because what is Yahweh doing? He's still looking for a man who can be refined and laid out on the altar that he can breathe his breath into and set you on fire. That should get you excited. It's interesting to me because if you go back and look at the shadow pictures here, it's incredible with what Yahweh's revealing to us. And so it seems to me that Nadab and Abihu and their fire pans or their censers, along with the addition of incense, was actually a mirror of that rehearsal that was taking place in Genesis 2, where the mist watered the ground with the altar and the throne of Yahweh. And you see Yahweh actually attending that altar himself, and he lays that man out as an offering of atonement on the tabernacle of the earth, and it became a rehearsal of a new man being formed out of the loins or the DNA of Yahweh. What did Yahweh tell Adam and Eve? Be fruitful and multiply and replenish, subdue, and have dominion. And that's been his plan since day one, to have a new man, a perfect man who would become a sacrifice or an offering in the earth in order to cleanse the tohu vabohu, or waste and desolate tabernacle, and restore it to its pre-fall condition. And so what you have is this Ish man, Esh, this man of fire, becoming a shadow picture of the last Adam, who would be the one new man, and that's who we were all looking towards in the scripture until the coming of our Messiah. Now, if you study the Torah, the rehearsal that you see these men involved in, bringing the fire pans, their censers into the holy place, was reserved for Aaron alone. And no evidence exists to suggest that Nadab and Abihu had instructions to burn incense at this time. Rather, if you go back and look at the ancient pattern in the heavenlies, it was the high priest alone who would enter in the holy place at Yom Kippur. This high priest would become a shadow picture of our Messiah. The whole thing that you see, all of the wilderness sacrifice, all of the wilderness rituals, were actually a shadow picture of what our Messiah would do when he would come 2,000 years later. And so it's a shadow picture of Yeshua, who would, in his future role, he would be chosen as the repairer of the breach. In other words, he was the one who would come and repair the breach of the altar so that he could then enter into the holy place and rehearse the creation or recreation of the last Adam, the new man. You can see that in Isaiah 58, verse 12. Those of you out of your loins, your generation, you're going to be part of those who repair the breach. And that's what Abba's preparing us for now. We are that one new man that's being raised up. We're part of the house of Israel. If you go back and read what Zechariah says about the bones lying in the valley and the two sticks coming together forming one stick, one new man. You find it in Ephesians. You find it in Hebrews, where Yahweh's constantly talking about the one new man, that middle wall of partition between he and man being broken down, and the two now, the eternal man and the carnal man, now purged by fire, form one new man. Look at the word for repairer. The repairer of the breach is the word gadar. It means to fence or to enclose, but it has the same numeric value, go figure, 207, as the Hebrew word for light, flame, or a blaze, or. And it just so happens that it's the same numeric value as the Hebrew word etzim for bones. There should be a fire in your bones if you are a repairer of the breach. In fact, you cannot repair the breach of the altar, because the altar has to be purged by fire. And so if our Yah is a consuming fire, and I'm a man who's on fire, and I have the fire down in my bones, what did Jeremiah say? I held my peace for a long time, but it's like a fire shut up in my bones. Why? Because you're the ones chosen to come to the altar that has been desecrated, and you literally throw yourself on that altar, and you set the altar on fire, and you become part of that repairer of the breach. The word breach here is the word paratz or paretz, that which is broken. It also has the same root as the word rispah, which means a live, burning coal. And then if you look at the Hebrew letter hey on the end of that, all of these things connect together. The Hebrew letter hey is the word or the letter that indicates to breathe upon something. What do you do when you breathe upon a live coal? It explodes into being. Can you see how all of these things are beginning to fit together? And so what makes this Torah portion, Acharei, after the death, what makes it so serious? Well, every one of us would agree that the wilderness tabernacle became a living rehearsal of the need for atonement because of the previously stated condition of Adam after the fall. After the fall, Adam became a man. Listen to me carefully. Adam became a man in constant need of atonement. So much so that his need for atonement could never be offset completely by the blood of bulls and goats. It could only set the judgment off for a season. It was not until our Messiah, Yeshua, came and gave himself that the atonement was set in motion to completely eradicate sin in our lives. Does that make sense? And so the only means of settlement that would suffice was the requirement of a sacrifice of the last Adam himself in order to once again purge the tohu vabohu, waste and desolate world. In other words, repair the breached altar again, and the blood of animals could never accomplish that. And when we look at what's taking place in the wilderness tabernacle, it's all about this rehearsal. It's all about what the requirements for bringing a fire offering, a sacrifice, the letting of blood, the shedding of blood, in order to purge something and make it kadosh, to make it holy. And so until the time of Messiah, the patterns would continue to be rehearsed in the tabernacle being the temporary dwelling place of Yahweh until the last Adam, our Messiah, came. And when he comes, listen to me, he is literally the DNA. He is the seed of Yahweh. If Yahweh is a consuming fire, our Messiah, Yeshua, is also a consuming fire. He was a living, burning ember. And until that living, burning ember had the incense, the breath of Yahweh blasted from his nostrils across the smoldering embers of Yeshua's DNA within the womb of his mother, that altar would never be reclaimed. And so if you go back and look what's happening, are y'all listening to me? Mary's womb becomes a picture of the bloody brazen altar. Mary's womb, the very place that our Messiah has to come through, she becomes a shadow picture of a broken, breached, and waste and desolate altar. From the time of the fall forward, no seed of Yahweh, no perfect man could be produced out of their loins, out of this altar. And it was not until our Messiah, Yeshua, comes. He has the DNA of Yahweh inside. He is literally inflamed with the loins and the seed of Yahweh, and he breaches the womb of his mother. Listen to me, when that happens, she becomes a shadow picture of the brazen altar outside the tabernacle. Listen to me. You couldn't even go inside the tabernacle. The tabernacle represents a fallen, carnal, fleshly man. You had to be cleansed before you went in to offer your sacrifices inside the tabernacle, and it's the brazen altar that first had to be cleansed. And so that first shedding of blood that issued forth out of her loins, out of Mary's loins, became stage one of Yahweh's purpose for cleansing the earth and his altar. Does that make sense to you? Now listen to me. This blew my mind as Father was speaking to me about this. As the baby, our Messiah, would exit the womb of his mother, a boundary of blood, just like you see formed at Passover. How many of you just celebrated Passover? And we know that the tradition says that we put the blood upon the doorposts and the lintels of every house. Am I right? And so as the baby's born, the blood of the mother and the baby is upon the loins of Mary, upon the legs of Mary. And according to ancient Near Eastern customs, it was upon the structures called the doorpost and the lintel that the gods of the household would be written. Listen to me, that's powerful. And if you applied blood upon the doorpost, then it would shatter all of previous covenants and commitments that have been made with the gods of that particular house. That blows my mind. And yet, there's one more step. If I apply the blood to the doorposts and the lintels, and I blot out the title, the names of that previous god, there's one more requirement, and that requirement is that I write the name of the new God, and I write the terms of the new covenant on the doorposts, not just on the doorposts of Mary's loins, but on the doorposts of my heart. Now you understand why traditionally there is a mezuzah applied to the doorposts of people's houses. Most people don't understand it. It's mezuzot, two. You should have one on either side of the doorpost and the lintel, because what you're doing is that you're declaring that there's a blood covenant. All former covenants with any god, any fleshly connection has been severed. And now the name of my God, Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, the creator of the universe, is the one that I serve. And here is the terms of the covenant written upon the doorpost of this house. Amen. And that rehearsal of writing the name of the deity upon the doorposts and the lintels was also rehearsed as Yeshua exits the womb. His mother calls him Yahweh, my salvation. And so there you have on the doorposts of the Mary's womb, upon the lintels, you see that application of the blood. Isn't that powerful? And all of you understand that when you go back and look at Passover, we would strike the doorposts and the lintels. We'd go up, across, and down. It forms the Hebrew letter Chet. Het is a Hebrew letter that indicates life, new beginnings. But let me just share this with you. According to ancient Near Eastern customs, every house at that particular time, because they understood threshold covenants, they understood blood covenants, there would be a threshold and a trench in that threshold between the two doorposts. And as I would strike the doorpost with the blood across the top and down again, just like Mary's womb is struck as the baby opened, the womb opens up and the baby's about to make its way out into the earth. That blood begins to pool in the threshold. And as it begins to pool, the blood begins to mingle together. Now it's forming not only the Hebrew letter Het, it forms the final Hebrew letter Mem. Hebrew letter Mem is the Hebrew letter that indicates that this has been a closed womb. Everything that had been inside, this was a virtuous womb, and the secrets of the Torah that have been contained in this womb, namely our Messiah, Yeshua, has now been released, and it is now an open womb, an open Mem, so that the Torah can be received by all those who will honor him. Say amen. It's interesting because if you look at the number value of the Hebrew letter Ket, and the Hebrew letter Mem, its value is 40. Ket's 8. 48 is the same value as the Hebrew word Yovel, a jubilee. And so at this first Passover, you see, we just celebrated, the household sacrifice would have to be replaced by the sacrifice at the designated place where Yahweh would choose to dwell. And so it would be in the wilderness tabernacle, the place where his name would be upon the gates and the tabernacle doorways, until you would have an ultimate offering called our Messiah, Yeshua. And it would be Yeshua and his offering that would renew the living tabernacle, the body of Adam, as the place where the king would ultimately dwell. Turn to your neighbor and tell him, I am one of the living stones of the tabernacle of the Most High. From that time forward, listen to me carefully, because we're about to see the third temple rebuilt. And we're about to see the reinstitution of animal sacrifices. And so once Yeshua offered his ultimate sacrifice and the living stones tabernacle begins to be formed, from that time forward, a sacrifice in any other place would cause one to trample underfoot the blood of our Messiah. And so for all intents and purposes, doing so would breach the altars again. The very altar that our Messiah had come and gave himself, offered his life, poured himself out on in order to reclaim the very breach that had been repaired. Now you find yourself invoking a tohu vabohu condition again, and you're now once more, just like Nadab and Abihu, you're inviting a consuming fire upon yourself. Now, I told you that was stage one. Stage two, at the execution of Messiah, we're talking about 2 steps in the stage of reclaiming the altars. And this is what Nadab and Abihu are acting out. They're literally acting out these stages. And so this is not something to just trivialize. This is not something to gloss over. This is not something to say, well, bless their heart, they did something in ignorance and Yahweh just snuffed them out. No, these men were part of the rehearsals and they had been trained for this, and I'm going to show you what happened back in Exodus 24. These men were calculated. They knew what they were doing. Stage 2 of the reclamation of the altars is where the blood of our Messiah spills out onto the earth. Remember when he's hanging on the execution stake? I love what was shared just a few weeks back when Shepherd John was talking about an olive tree. I believe with all my heart, my wife Brenda was doing some research on the olive tree. I also believe that it would have been an olive tree there planted as the staff of King David. Are you listening to me? And so while he's being executed, there's a violent earthquake. The Adama, the ground, the Adama altar opens its mouth and receives the blood of our Messiah. The blood, the light, the incense, the breath of Yahweh is received back into the loins of the Adama, and the blood falls into that crack. And I'm convinced it was Jeremiah's grotto. I believe that Jeremiah had intentionally hidden the Ark of the Covenant inside that grotto. And so you find that as the blood of Messiah is spilling back out onto the earth, that it falls onto the golden altar or the mercy seat known as the Ark of the Covenant that had been hidden beneath the mount. Underneath the rod of David, the olive branch of Shalom that had been planted upon the place where it had been broken and there was enmity between us and Yahweh. That place known as Golgotha, also known as Golgolet. It's the plural form of the word galal, which means to roll something away. Listen to me. It indicates to roll it away as in a broad sweep of time. It expresses a circular motion, not only like in the head or the skull, as your head or your skull will be circular, but it also indicates a cyclical measure of time or an age. He's rolling back time as this happens, and he's rolling back time for a reason. I'm going to show you that in a few minutes. Golgotha was the place where heads were counted for genealogical records. You couldn't access the temple at that time without your family's lineage was calculated. And so if you wanted to find out if you could enter, you went to Golgotha, the place where heads were counted. As the blood falls, the blood of our Messiah, this is the second stage, it stops time as we know it. It reaches back simultaneously all the way back to the Adam, and then all the way forward to the last individual who will be born in the future. And at the same time, it breathes into the man a consuming fire. The incense of the DNA of Elohim, and simultaneously it restores the breach altars in the priestly lineage of the sons of Elohim. And it links together Passover, which is where the brazen altar is seen, and Yom Kippur, the golden altar. The brazen altar represents the fallen man, and the golden altar of incense represents the eternal man who had been separated by that enmity between us, the middle wall of partition, the veil of the flesh, the carnal man. It's broken down, and now the two altars become one. Yom Kippur and Passover move together simultaneously so that Yahweh could accomplish the reclamation of his altar throne. So now you can see why I call them abominable acts of Nadab and Abihu cause them to be destroyed. And so I had to ask you, strange fire? Really? Let's look a little bit closer. The wilderness sacrificial rehearsals could only point towards Messiah's coming, and the purpose of his coming was to restore the Adamic altar, and thus Adam. We could not have been restored. We could not have been able to expect an eternal reunion with our King if it had not been for what our Messiah did. The sacrifices that you see in the wilderness tabernacle could never reclaim or never restore the altar throne of Yahweh. And so you need to understand why Aaron is being given some specific instructions here regarding proper protocol, because what Aaron's doing, he's not teaching us that this is the way that you're going to approach me forever, because this is a temporary rehearsal. What Aaron's doing, he's pointing to a day through these rehearsals. He's actually instituting the rehearsals, and he's pointing to a day when Yeshua would come and he would fulfill a final rehearsal or a final ritual, and then the need for the Aaronic priesthood would cease, because the Melchizedek priesthood that had been there all the way back in Genesis 1, are you listening to me, would be set back in motion. And the high priest, Yeshua, would forever attend the altar throne on behalf of us. Does that make sense to you? Listen to this. Leviticus 10:1. Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer and put fire therein and put incense thereon and offered strange fire before Yahweh, which he commanded them not. That's enough. If Yahweh didn't tell you to do it, don't do it. Listen to me. One of the arguments that I hear all the time is that he knows my heart. Yes, he does. That's why he's going to consume you with fire. He knows my heart. Yes, he does. That's why he's been allowing you to go through these trials and tribulations, hoping to get something through that thick skull of yours regarding being simply obedient. Obedience is better than sacrifice. And that's all Abba's looking for. Are you listening? Because if you don't listen to Yahweh and you call yourself a king and a priest, I know for the last 30 years I've been hearing people, well, we're kings and priests. Okay, if you are, then you need to know how to officiate the altar and the throne of Yahweh. You need to know how to come before him. If you don't know how to properly approach him, then the moment that you try to come before him, knowing the price that's been paid, our Messiah shed blood, then what you're guilty of is trampling underfoot. You're literally coming across that threshold. In fact, if I was invited to your house and we had a covenant meal together and we slaughtered an animal and we put the blood of that animal upon the doorpost and it rolls and falls down into that trench across that threshold, and you and I have set ourselves in covenant agreement. If I step into the blood there at that threshold, you and I have just now breached covenant, and we are enemies forever. Of how much sorer punishment, suppose ye, when we trample underfoot the blood of Messiah. We need to think these things out. And so we need to know what caused him to offer strange fire. And so I want you to look just back a little bit before Leviticus into Exodus chapter 30, verse 9. Look at this prohibition. You shall offer no strange incense thereon, nor burnt sacrifice, nor meat offering, neither shall you pour drink offering thereon. And so some people argue that they were killed because they brought strange fire. In other words, they brought fire of their own making, rather than the coals that was required from a perpetual fire that was there at the brazen altar. I submit to you, those two boys were lazy. All they had to do was come by the brazen altar, take the censer, reach in and scoop the coals up. They did that. They didn't go and start a fire of their own. In fact, if you look for clues, they didn't have permission to even bring fire pans themselves. But it was not until they put incense on the fire that it became a strange fire. And so it's not so much that they went by the brazen altar and scooped up the blazing embers. It's the fact that they had the unmitigated gall to add the incense to it. The incense, remember, we took you all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. The incense represents the breath of Yahweh being breathed upon those coals. Yahweh's the consuming fire. Are you following me? Strange fire. Strange comes from the Hebrew word, Strong's number 2114, zur, and it's defined as a stranger, go figure that, foreigner, one who's profane, a strange woman as in a harlot, but it also indicates to turn aside or to depart from the way. So the very moment that you see them bringing strange fire, the intent of these two individuals, remember Nadab means one who incites or induces other people, who compels other people to follow his way. Are you with me? So by his actions here are inciting the people to turn or aside or depart from the way. But it goes even further, the definition. It means to be of another family, to commit adultery in order to be from another family, that which is unlawful or loathsome. This is what this strange fire represented. And remember, it wasn't strange fire until they offered incense, because they went by the brazen altar. It would have been strange in the sense that they were not called to offer it, but just for the argument's sake, it was when they put incense on it as well. And remember the Hebrew word for fire, esh. Same as the Hebrew word etymologically for man, ish. And so I ask the question, is it possible that these two sons of Aaron, that they're guilty of trying to use a profaned seed to bring forth life from a corrupt man or a corrupt fire? Remember, seed and word are breathed. They become a symbol. Your words become a symbolic incense. Let me just ask you, each one of you made the declaration a while ago that I'm an ish. I'm a man of fire. I'm a man on fire, right? And so if I'm speaking to this man sitting right here who is a man on fire, my words become incense, and I speak words, release the incense onto this fire. What have I attempted to create? My words need to be the word or the seed of Yahweh, or else I'm guilty of bringing a strange fire once again. Does that make sense to you? It's indicating a symbolic departing of the way, that perhaps a seed from another family that would have been considered loathsome to Yahweh is being offered. I want you to remember that. The acts here of Nadab and Abihu, I'm convinced, were exacerbated because of what had happened with them back in Exodus chapter 24. If you don't go back and get context for these stories, you're going to miss it. If you just stop right here, you're reading that there's a rituals going on, and for 7 days they're being taught some proper protocol. But if you don't understand what transpired almost a year ago, you're going to miss why their acts and the punishment for their acts is intensified. Would you like to find out? Remember Exodus chapter 24, 1 through 18. Nadab and Abihu, along with Moshe, Aaron, and Joshua, and 70 elders are invited to Mount Sinai, 75 total. And they're told to come here and worship afar off. Not only are they invited to come and worship, they're actually allowed to see the Elohim of Israel, and I believe that was Yeshua himself in the flesh. And while there, they participate in a covenant meal. And if you go back and understand what was transpiring there at Exodus chapter 24, you know that it's the reading of the wedding ketubah, it's the wedding covenant. It contains not only the terms of the wedding covenant, but it rehearses in front of creation the bride's price, which is required of the husband. The bride's price indicates that he is going to give his life, his blood for her. And all of that is rehearsed here on Mount Sinai. And as that's rehearsed, it's completing his role in restoring and reclaiming that golden altar throne of creation, the Adama altar. It's completing the rehearsal. It sets it in motion. But it also gives instructions to the Adam, because Israel here is supposed to be taking Adam's place. And Adam is being given instructions that are necessary in order to repair the breach, not only in the Adama altar, but in the brazen altar, because here the brazen altar is where the flesh is burnt up. And so Israel, Adam, is being shown what they're supposed to do while they're on this mountain, how they're supposed to get their flesh in order so that they can become the representation of Messiah on the earth until such time as Messiah comes. Does that make sense? This revelation would have restored Adam, Israel, and the plans are revealed as the terms are read and as all parties come into agreement, and they culminate that agreement by sharing a covenant meal. You have the vision of the Creator's feet, and it shows that his feet are set upon a sapphire floor. The earth is his footstool and becomes his throne. You can see that both in Ezekiel and in the book of Revelation. I'm convinced that not only were they shown the pattern there in Mount Sinai that they were to be duplicating in the wilderness, but they saw the pattern in the heavens above, and they saw the Messiah's feet resting on the altar, the place where mercy abides. And that's why I'm convinced that because of the condition of the heart of those men, in particular Nadab and Abihu, because they had been planning what they did with the fire pots for some time, I'm convinced that it was because they approached the mercy seat, and the king's feet was upon the mercy seat, that they were allowed to live. Did y'all hear that? These 75 men are selected to become the image and likeness of Yahweh in the earth, all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, when Yahweh says, let us make man in our image and our likeness. These 75 men were supposed to become the image and likeness of Yahweh until such time as our Messiah Yeshua would come. And they were supposedly, in my opinion, to set the precedent for Yeshua to be offered in the earth. That's why they are told, come up and worship afar off. Look at the word for worship here. It comes from the Hebrew word. It means to prostrate oneself. And when you hear this word, you think it just means to bow down, but it literally means to lay yourself supine, wholly and completely on the ground, on the altar. And then it says to worship afar off. It's translated as a remote place, but it's actually talking about a place where time collapses. Are you listening to what I'm sharing? Time that had been created in Genesis chapter 3, I'm convinced, was created for man. Prior to Genesis chapter 3, there was no need for time as we know it. I believe that the carnal, fleshly man has to have time. Prior to that, we could step in and out of time. Does that make sense to you? And so what they were being shown was an opportunity to step into a specific portal or a gateway, and we're going to look at that. And the purpose for that was so that they could reenact the events of Genesis chapter 2. They were going to be the Adam of Genesis chapter 2. And they were going to be laying prostrate upon the Adama altar, and they were going to have breathed into their bodies the incense breath of Yahweh. At Sinai, these men stepped into eternity, not bound by space or time. And they stepped there in order to begin the reclamation project of the brazen altar outside the tabernacle where the flesh is burned, while the Adama altar, the golden altar throne of mercy, stood right in front of them. Time was suspended. And you see the same thing at Pesach and Yom Kippur. Time was suspended. And Yahweh and the last Adam become one, Echad, right there on Mount Sinai. Look at this, a paved work of sapphire stone. The word paved is the word livnah, and it's translated as pavement, brick, whiteness, transparency, to purify. The lamed prefix indicates towards something, for the purpose of something. And then you have Beit Nun Hey, Banah. Say that with me, Banah. Banana. Now just check and see if you were paying attention. It means to begin to build, as in to begin to build a family name. They're brought to a paved place. They're brought to the foundation or the floor for the purpose of beginning to build a family name. A paved work. The word there is masa, and it means to make, to fashion, a transaction taking place so that you can begin to make, to ordain. And then you have the word sapphire. It's from the root saphir, from the root saphar, which means to recount, to declare, to number, to etch something as you would score it with a mark, like a jeweler would take a piece of jewelry and score it, etch it, to write or scribe letters in a book. Do y'all see that? These 75 men were called to witness Yahweh beginning to form or bring into existence, to fashion the one new man who would begin the family name as written Sephard in the book or the scroll of the heavens. And if you go back, all you have to do, don't take my word for it, go back and look at the account here of Acharei in Leviticus, and then look in Exodus chapter 24 and note the parallels. It's uncanny. These two men, Nadab and Abihu, had absolutely no excuse. Theirs was not an act of ignorance. They had participated in this rehearsal at Sinai and had been actively for almost a year rehearsing with Moshe up until the time of their death. And take note, the same rehearsals that they're being prepared for to initiate the tabernacle took place, the same sacrifices took place on top of Mount Sinai. Only 2 occasions in the Torah did Moshe sprinkle blood. Once on Mount Sinai, Exodus chapter 24, and then once in this account where these 2 men are being prepared. Both instances, a covenant meal is partaken of, and it's Mount Sinai, and in the consecrating of this Aaron and his sons. And then in both cases, they are instructed to wait 7 days. And in both cases, Exodus chapter 24, and in this case, a consuming fire falls down from heaven. Boom. So you tell me that these men did not know what they were doing. Having been part of this covenant reenactment, they had readily submitted themselves to. They participated in the covenant meal, fully acknowledging that they understood all that you have said we will do. And so it puts strange fire in a different light, in my opinion. This was deliberate and calculated. I believe it was an intentional affront to Yahweh, and I believe the purpose of it was to bring shame upon the priestly rehearsals that they had saw demonstrated on top of Mount Sinai, and that they were being trained, the rehearsals that were there to restore the altars. And the restoration of those altars would also simultaneously restore the sons of Elohim, bring forth seed, bring forth sons. And it's my opinion that they personally denigrated the one who was represented in the rehearsals, the one they saw whose feet was on the sapphire pavement, the one whose feet rested upon the altar. And so you have to ask yourself, what were these men thinking, and how long had it been in their hearts? I believe it came from a deeply rooted rebellion. For instance, we're told in more than one place that neither of these 2 men had children. Numbers chapter 3 verse 4 specifies it. 1 Chronicles chapter 24 verse 2 specifies it. There has to be something wrong for these 2 priests to not have children, or else it would not have been called attention to. So what does this have to do with our parsha? Remember, Adam's a high priest of the earth. Would everybody agree? The first high priest of the earth. As high priest, Adam is given a commandment. Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it. And I know you probably don't think that it really has much significance, but how many of you remember the story of Judah and Tamar? Tamar's husband dies. The sons of Judah, this was one of the sons of Judah. 2 of the remaining sons of Judah are required to fill the Levirate responsibility of raising up seed for a deceased brother who has no children. Listen to me. Having children was important to Yahweh. For a man to produce seed was important to Yahweh. Are you listening to me? Both and Onan refused to raise up seed to continue the lineage, and both, go back and read the story, both are killed by Yahweh. the obligation to raise up sons in the image of Yahweh is not a suggestion. Image is the Hebrew word selim. It means resemblance. And so the purpose of producing sons is in order for us to function in what I would recall a perpetual rehearsal, because each son that I produce is called on by Yahweh to serve the altar of their house. And in serving the altar of their house, they're required to attend the presence of Yahweh, and they then in turn become the fire censer. They become the vessels containing not only the fire but the incense of Yahweh. They literally become the living fire that is offered upon a perpetual altar throne in their own house. Every time you see a family unit begin, it's creating a rehearsal of an eternal tabernacle, an eternal priesthood, and each marriage union produces more sons, and as it does, it perpetuates the promise of redemption and memorializes the God whose name is emblazoned upon the doorposts and lintels of that house. That's why raising up children in the nurture and admonition of Yahweh is not a suggestion. And that's why this country is in the condition we are now, because the family structure has been compromised to such an extent that the family union is so weak it's almost become extinct. And so I suggest to you that there can be no middle ground. Either we repair the breached altars and we begin in our own lives and then we extend it into our house, or by our acquiescence we sustain that tohu vabohu condition, and in doing so we denigrate the image of Yahweh. He, the one who is the Messiah, Yeshua, our King, and we trample underfoot his blood. And it's my opinion that Nadab and Abihu knew what they were doing, and they were calculated in the process. I believe that they were refusing to raise up sons to attend the altar that would become the throne of the Melchizedek king. I believe that what they were doing was attempting to continue to postpone the coming of the Melchizedek order in order that the house of Levi could have its notoriety extended. And I believe that I know Yahweh put the house of Levi where they're supposed to be, but it was for a season. But I also am convinced that there's a move afoot feverishly as we speak to restore Nadab and Abihu and their strange fire, and it's going to be offered again very soon upon a breached altar that's going to be called the third temple. These men knew that the rehearsals that they were called on to be involved in, they saw it on Mount Sinai. They knew that its purpose was to eventually establish the Melchizedek priesthood for the purpose of officiating the altar thrones of Yahweh here on the earth. They had met the high priest who would attend that altar throne on Mount Sinai, Yeshua. And I'm convinced that it was their selfish, lustful motives that exposed their own secret intent to keep the Levitical priesthood in its place. And it's going to be repeated in the days ahead as the house of Levi once more brings strange fire, only this time it's going to be a counterfeit temple. Listen to me. But at the same time, the living stones of the altar and the tabernacle, the true altar and the true tabernacle, are now being assembled, and the Melchizedek priesthood is making itself ready. I tell you, the breach is being repaired. And I want to close with this verse. Isaiah 58, verse 12. And they, listen to me, this blesses me. Some of you out here listening to this have children that are not in the place that they should be right now at the particular moment. But this needs to be your confession. And they that be of me shall build the old waste places. They shall raise up the foundations of many generations. We've got to start thinking generationally and do whatever's necessary to put this man on the altar so that I can become a blazing fire for my house and my family. And you will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. That's the legacy that Abba has for you and I. And I'm convinced that we're seeing that live down in front of us. And I hope that you were able to understand the gravity of the sin of Nadab and Abihu and understand fully what your place is in the days ahead to attend the altar of Yahweh. Shabbat Shalom.